Hey guys, it's me, a guy named James, talking about queer characters in media. Except, well, I'm a different James. I don't plagiarize. As that joke of mine implies, well, that and of course the title and thumbnail you have clicked on. We're talking about queer characters, representation, conspiracy theories, and Disney today. Which is a pretty full itinerary, if you ask me. Since we're talking about conspiracy and queerness, I had to represent. We're talking about Dipper today. We're talking about Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls is a series created by Alex Hirsch, an insane man who loves puzzles, ciphers, and pissing off Disney with the mere existence of some of his ideas.
And finally, it was after 5 emails, they were like, we're not budging. We budged before, this is the last straw. So I was like, okay, replace bottles will be spun with not S&P approved. I was just basically being a dick at that point.
It's been pretty well documented how much has changed behind the scenes of Gravity Falls. Because of this, people began theorizing what may have been floating through Alex's head as he made the show. And that's where the idea for this video comes from. I watched every episode of Gravity Falls, read both main books, skimmed through the panels I could find of the comics since I couldn't find them, and I listened to every commentary track throughout the series, which you can find here on Spotify, which made life easy since I don't own the box set yet. In this video, we're going to talk about and dissect the commonly held headcanon that Dipper Pines, our protagonist, or one of them, is transgender. Now, before we get started, a couple of house cleaning things. I am pansexual, but I am also cisgender. We support our trans friends on this channel. In fact, our editor for this episode is gender fluid. This being said, I cannot speak on the transgender experience. What I can say is that through my research process, I worked alongside my brother, who is transmasculine. So I think even if I'm not the best person to talk about all of this, I feel I have a little bit of knowledge. Finally, if you're homophobic, transphobic, or otherwise an asshole, please leave. I do not want you in my community, and this video, despite its provocative title, is not an excuse to be an asshole. So let's get into what this video will entail. As always, the timestamps for each section will be in the description below, and that means you can skip around to whatever interests you. But as a quick breakdown, we're going to start by describing all of our potential theories, then we'll break down each one individually. I'll speak about my personal headcanons, and we'll bring it all together and discuss what we can learn from this and what it means for Gravity Falls as a whole. Finally, if I missed anything, please inform me, because I am merely a man with autism who gets a little too obsessed with the dumb stuff and sometimes misses important things. So, I've been writing this script since April, but as I was in the middle of writing this, Lily Simpson, who has done dozens of these kinds of videos, put out a video about Gravity Falls. It's shorter than this one, probably, and probably not as in-depth, but please go check it out. The link, of course, is in the description. Also, the fact this video took so long to write seems to be beneficial, as Alex Hirsch is seemingly teasing Gravity Falls content on his TikTok. So there are 3 main theories we'll be breaking down today. Theory 1 is Transmasc Theory. This is the most common interpretation of the theory I've personally seen. This version of the theory describes that Dipper Pines is actually a trans man, born as a female but identifying as a man. This is the main theory that jump-started this video because of how common it seems to be in the fandom. So much so, I see people complaining about this headcanon almost as much as I see art or videos about people discussing this headcanon genuinely. This will likely end up being the longest section of the video because there is a lot to dissect. Theory 2 is the Transfemme Theory. It's the exact same theory, but in reverse. Dipper is actually born a male, but is wanting to identify as a woman. One will notice a subtle difference here. Dipper throughout the series does not identify as a woman, so this theory posits that Dipper doesn't yet know he is transfemme. This is a very interesting theory, and we will discuss it at length later. Finally, the third and final theory, the cisgender theory. This is probably the most common, and if we're honest, canon theory. This is positing that, yeah, Dipper is just cis. He is born a male and identifies as a man. We will discuss this, even if some may not feel it's necessary. It's a fun thing to discuss, so we shall. But I agree, it's probably the least interesting to talk about. These 3 theories will be the backbone of the video. Each one of them has evidence for and against them, so we're going to break each down and figure out which one we think is the best one. And comment down below which one you think sounds the most likely. So, this is the main theory we'll be talking about today. Was Dipper born a girl and is identifying as a boy? Well, let's talk about it. Now, it's difficult to pinpoint where exactly this theory first stemmed from, but it all seems to stem from Season 1, Episode 6, episode Dipper versus Manliness. Throughout this episode, Dipper is struggling with his aforementioned manliness in a variety of ways, but it's clear that these struggles seem to be really appreciated by trans men the world over. We learn through the episode that Dipper gets his first chest hair and has to spend a while deconstructing toxic masculinity through the Manotars. But this episode is not the only reason why people put forward this headcanon. In fact, there's evidence for it as early as episode 1.
The judges say it's out of bounds.
You're out of bounds!
No, it's true. Although it does require a bit of thought and assumption on our end, so let's start tackling the evidence. Starting with the very first episode, we learn that Dipper is a chosen name. He refers it over his real name. And this is made even clearer with one of the very first pages we see from Dipper's perspective in Journal 3. He fully crosses out his real name and replaces it with Dipper, not even finishing his name initially. Now, we learn later that his real name is Mason. This is an interesting name, because Mason is a masculine-leaning, but traditionally gender-neutral name of British origin. Sure, most people see Mason as a masculine name, and that's fair. But the fact he refuses to use it in either the show or the book implies to me it may have something to do with some form of gender dysphoria. Now, this alone may not be evidence of severe gender dysphoria, but it is definitely something to think about, especially considering it's a common thing for trans people. Something else that is common in young trans men, especially those in their early stages, is both having messy, often self-cut hair and hiding their natural hair. Obviously, this evidence is rather anecdotal, but according to my brother, it's relatively common. We see Dipper do this, well, mostly. His hair is extremely messy, and he is often seen hiding it with his hat. In fact, it is very, very rare that we see him without his hat.
Oh, man! Why you gotta be so complicated?
Not only this, but throughout the series, his masculinity, or lack thereof, is often a sticking point. He feels very insecure about it, such as when he doesn't like being called adorable in episode 3.
You are adorable. Adorable?
Because she's adorable.
The episode has it as a crux of the plot. He even corrects the manliest man in the show, a man literally named Manly Dan, on being a little girl.
Before?
Listen, little girl!
Hey, actually,
I wouldn't pick my teeth with that axe. It's left-handed.
This very fragile form of masculinity is in line with someone who cares very deeply about how they're perceived, and young trans people are very often quick to correct people on their identity. This is one of the few areas that Dipper is shown to be confident enough in correcting someone, as he's not a very confident person in other episodes. He continually corrects people throughout this episode and our other big episode for this theory, episode 6, which we'll get into in depth in just a moment. Dipper is shown to take masculinity serious enough to do traditionally masculine things when and where possible, such as constantly doing dude stuff with Zeus.
Never want to do girly stuff with me. You and Sis get to do boy stuff all the time.
What do you mean?
Hey, dude, you ready to blow up these hot dogs in the microwave one by one?
Am I?
The fact that Mabel specifically calls out that Dipper doesn't want to do girly stuff is actually a really interesting implication for this theory. If you take this theory as true, or at least if you subscribe to it, this could mean that he's done girly stuff with her prior to their summer in Gravity Falls, but wants to be seen as more masculine around his extended family. If this is the implication, this actually tracks really well with real trans people who do the same thing. If no one ever knows you weren't born a boy, you won't be misgendered. Other things point to similar thought processes. He constantly refers to himself as a man, and will always introduce himself as such when possible, which obviously works, since most people do automatically associate him as a boy. Now, there is another interesting...
Now is not the time to talk about the Lammy dance.
But I mean, this is, well, not a super important piece of information.
Oh, no!
Fine, I won't talk about how the Lammy dance is called feminine by Pa, and is seen as a stark form of embarrassment for Dipper.
That was some fine girly dancing, boy.
Many other episodes continually degrade Dipper's masculinity.
Ha ha ha! You fight like a girl who was also a baby!
He also shows other signs of potentially being trans, such as the aversion to being touched.
Thank you!
No, everyone's touching everything!
Or potential body dysphoria in public, where he's comfortable being shirtless in front of his family, but not in public. Like at the public pool, he obviously wants a more masculine name than Mason, as seen in episode 7.
Definitely not. You know what name I've always wanted? Tyrone? Okay, Tyrone?
But the most interesting thing about this is his voice. Voice dysphoria is a subsect of gender dysphoria, a topic that we're all familiar with by this point in the video. According to the NIH, 79% of respondents experienced gender incongruence secondary to their voice. Voice was the second most important factor contributing to gender dysphoria after upper body. And Dipper's voice is a constant point of contention for his character. In fact, in the episode Bottomless Pit, Dipper's story is specifically about his voice. Voiceover is a pretty strong dissection of his dysphoria regarding his voice, and it's not the only episode that features this strangely specific character trait. In A Tale of Two Stands, Dipper notably pushes his voice down a register after he screams in excitement.
I began to keep a journal.
The journals! Sorry, just got excited there about the journals. Keep talking.
Another interesting through line, specifically in the first season, is Dipper portraying himself as more masculine in his fantasies. We see this as early as episode 2.
Guys, imagine what would happen if we got that picture.
Tonight, we're here with adventure seeker Dipper Pines.
We see it again in Double Dipper.
The final step is to ask her to dance.
Oh, Dipper, I'm so happy you decided to work the ticket stand with me.
And of course with his voice and voiceover.
Good morning, Dipper. I did it. I did it. Now I have a new voice.
Which is perhaps the most exaggerated masculine voice he could have. But there are 2 episodes in particular that I think really elevate this theory. The first, of course, Season 1, Episode 6, better known as Dipper versus Manliness, is perhaps the most important episode for this entire discussion. And as far as I can tell, where most people first thought up the headcanon. This episode is quite divisive, and while not my least favorite episode in the series, or even the season for that matter, it's considered one of the bottom 10 episodes according to IMDb. Even Alex Hirsch himself doesn't really like this episode.
This episode almost killed me. Like, I was so frustrated with how this episode came out. And
Really?
Yes. And in retrospect, I don't have a problem with it. There's a lot of great gags.
Now, in that same commentary, Alex says in hindsight he doesn't hate it anymore. But I think it goes to show how divisive this episode is. This, of course, doesn't change just how important it is to this discussion. In fact, it's pretty much the center of discussion for this headcanon, even though, as I've shown, there's plenty of evidence for it outside of the episode. Now, this episode comes from the want to do an episode about puberty, and being one of the first episodes they created, it's not really a surprise that it's a very odd addition to the series. So much so that Alex said that the tone of this episode is not the tone of Gravity Falls in the commentary. Throughout the episode, Dipper and his masculinity is the focus of the episode, and it's not even subtle how this episode can be viewed through a trans lens. Dipper starts out this episode trying to flex his masculinity with a manliness testing machine, spurned on by his family insulting his masculinity, of course.
Manliness tester.
Beating.
He says he's...
After being outclassed by a local manly man, Manly Dan, he rushes out and immediately starts to take everything said to and about him as a dig at his masculinity, including this iconic line that a lot of people tend to point towards.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for the mailman.
Oh, what? Are you saying I'm not a male man? Is that what you're trying to say? I'm not male? I'm not a man? Is that what you're getting at?
Are you crying?
This clip is one of the many reasons people picked up this theory, and it's easy to see why. The wording is very interesting, and Dipper's fragile masculinity being the focal point of an episode was always going to lead to debates like this. This entire episode has moments like this, deconstructing both the toxic masculinity of the Manotaurs and Dipper's own experience with his own masculinity. There's not much else to talk about in regards to this episode. Most of it is pushing back against traditionally, overtly masculine things and the toxic implications of them. Dipper goes through a multitude of trials to prove his manliness, but by the end accepts that he may not be a man by the definition given to him by toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity, of course, often disregards trans men, notably so, and accepting that fact can be hard for some of them. However, Dipper is reassured by the end of the episode.
But it just wasn't right, so I said no.
You were your own man and you stood up for yourself.
Huh?
Yeah, you did what was right even though no one agreed with you. Sounds pretty manly to me, but what do I know?
Dipper's struggle with masculinity, and as the title implies, manliness, speaks heavily to trans men, and it's very clear as to why this episode is often cited in this discussion. But I wish to put forward a second episode that I think also fits.
I love this guy! Don't you go nowhere!
Also in Season 1 is the episode Carpe Diem. This episode isn't talked about as often when it comes to this headcanon or theory, but I think it's worth speaking about in this video because it adds a lot of potential angles for this theory we didn't think about prior. Carpe Diem is the body swapping episode of Gravity Falls, and it focuses on Dipper and Mabel swapping bodies. Almost immediately, you may notice why I want to talk about this episode. Upon swapping bodies, Dipper and Mabel are both extremely perturbed to be in each other's bodies, although Dipper seemed more disturbed generally.
Well, I guess I'm a pig now, so that's a thing.
While Mabel starts puking from being in Dipper's body, Dipper has what one could consider a panic attack.
This isn't happening! This isn't happening! This isn't happening!
Now, in my mind, this could be because he is being forced into a feminine body despite all of his attempts to be masculine, and it's insanely dysphoric for him. Throughout the episode, we see that even though Dipper is averse to feminine things like makeup, he is not nearly as disturbed by doing girly things as Mabel is by doing boyish things. This could be because Dipper was doing girly things when he was younger and is more used to them. In fact, he seems more annoyed than anything, which in and of itself may be a sign that he's done them in the past. In fact, while in Mabel's body, Dipper is shown to unintentionally do girly things, as if he is used to performing a version of femininity he doesn't identify with.
Stan gave you the room.
Yes, all right!
The fact that Dipper seems to slide into pretending to be Mabel much quicker, despite his initial terror, points to me that it's maybe because he's used to performing a version of femininity. Of course, this alone isn't enough to convince people, I'm sure, but considering everything else we've talked about, one could see why we think this way. However, we're not done discussing, not even close. Let's go on a little bit of a tangent.
Kids! I can't find the remote and I refuse to stand up!
Now, I'll be honest, this section is going to sound kind of crazy. The finger theory is something I noticed on my most recent rewatch of the series. The mismatched amount of fingers some characters have. A lot of characters have 5, but some, including Dipper, only have 4. As we were writing this and doing research, we noticed that typically women in the series have 4 fingers and men typically have 5. We thought this might be something to bring up in relation to the trans theory, because there's a lot of weird bouncing between who has how many fingers. For example, Stan has 5 fingers, both as an adult and a child, as does Zeus. However, characters like Robbie and Gideon only have 4. So it's wildly inconvenient in a lot of ways. We can't really use this as evidence for the trans theory, despite Dipper only having 4 like most women and Grenda having 5 like most men, according to the creative director of the show, Mike Rianda. In the character design phase, the character designers thought that some characters looked better with 5 fingers and some looked better with 4. They were right. The characters do visually look better that way, but we should have been consistent for various reasons. Our bad. Just pretend they all have 5. So that means this theory doesn't mean much, but if it wasn't a big cornerstone of the whole thing, why include it all, I hear you ask? Well, it was a pretty important part of the writing process, and goes to show that not everything ends up mattering in the end. Speaking of what matters, I think it's time to find out what the most important man for this video has to say. Alex Hirsch.
The thing that occasionally becomes tricky about it is that every now and then, like a fan idea will emerge that is so powerful that people love so much that they will start to treat it like it's really the show, and then they'll be like, Alex, why isn't that in the show? And I'm like, because you guys made it up. I've never heard of this before. What is this?
Alex Hirsch is, of course, the creator of the show, so his words are very important, as word of God can mean a lot for discussions like this. So what does Alex Hirsch say about this theory? Not much, honestly. Now, if you troll through the internet, you've probably heard a few things about what Alex Hirsch has said, and they're always annoyingly unsourced. Some people say, Alex Hirsch confirmed Dipper was supposed to be trans. Others say the opposite. This war of supposed Alex Hirsch comments makes things difficult to wade through. People point to supposed interviews where he says these things, but there's never a link or a source, and believe me, I looked. Now, I could just be missing things. That is always a possibility. But as far as I can tell, there's no evidence to suggest that Alex Hirsch has outright deconfirmed this theory. People like to point to quotes like these.
Somewhere else, and I pitched
this just being like remembering my summers with my sister and then just adding Grunkle Stan was sort of the thing I thought would get them to not pick up the show. It was
direct evidence that Dipper can't possibly be trans, because he's based on Alex himself. Which, yes, Alex has said multiple times, as far as I can tell, that Dipper and Mabel are based on him and Ariel. More so the latter, but that's not exactly the point. This doesn't necessarily disprove the trans theory by any standard. Alex has gone on record multiple times that there was supposed to be more LGBTQIA plus representation in Gravity Falls as a whole, like here, or with his iconic tweet. Mabel was shown to be an ally, according to Alex. Still, perhaps the most interesting tweet is this one, which is replying to a sadly now deleted tweet, but implies that there was instances of characters that were supposed to be LGBTQ that didn't get the chance. While I can't find what he was replying to, I doubt it was anything that would meaningfully sway this specific discussion. In 2016, Alex did say this. However, this doesn't prove or disprove anything, and it's obviously not how Alex sees the situation nowadays, because we have plenty of non-show canon, like the Lost Legends comics or the Book of Bill, which are notably not the show. He also notably said this. He doesn't have any ill will nor love for headcanon, so once again, doesn't really prove anything. Now, as far as I can tell, Alex has never said concretely, one way or the other, if Dipper was intended to be trans or not. It's safe to assume that he isn't supposed to be, but to quote the man himself,
like Disco Girl is something the fans loved, and like, you know, we're living in a time where there is massive cultural upheaval about how to be most sensitive and useful and progressive about conversations about gender. And this episode was written just a few years ago, but practically in another world when you consider those types of conversations. And I was a little scared to go back and watch it like, oh no, like, did we make a point or suggest something that felt, you know, really out of step with the modern moment? And going back and watching it, it feels,
doesn't at all.
It feels funny, it feels sweet, the heart feels in the right place. And, you know, I would take any critique if someone had it.
But I can hear people preparing to type up their comments about this thing or that thing, so let me dismantle a few common arguments I've seen responding to this theory and explain why I don't think these talking points are as useful or correct as some people may think they are. So a common criticism or complaint I've seen about this is that it makes the story come off in a transphobic lens. And this is the only counter-argument I can actually understand. The show constantly makes fun of Dipper, and sure, episodes like Northwest Mansion Mystery and Gideon Rises very clearly don't do this, but there are quite a few episodes that do this. However, I don't think this is necessarily a problem, nor something that actually disproves or harms the theory in any way. Dipper's treatment is unfair, sure, but I don't think that would necessarily make the show transphobic. Especially since we know Alex says he beats up Dipper because of himself. Similarly, this is a new one. I hadn't heard this talking point until doing the research for this video. And I need to talk about this. They admit that this idea is a stretch. The idea that Dipper's arc could be read as him disregarding his queerness for the sake of his family, which very clearly does not happen. Dipper stays just as weird at the end of the series as he does at the beginning. To argue that he is rejecting his queerness is very odd to me. The only piece of evidence I could think of that would make sense with that point is him giving up working for Ford for Mabel's sake, but that doesn't actually happen that way. Dipper never actually gives up working with Ford. Other things happen that lead to that no longer being a viable option. The most notable of which being Weird Mageddon. I don't think that makes sense to say, because Dipper stays the same amount of queer throughout the entire series, if not getting weirder by the end. I mean, unless you headcanon him as Transfemme, but we're not getting into that right now, as there are other criticisms I need to dismantle. Okay, these ones I don't have screenshots of, but are ones I've heard in the past to discredit either this theory or similar ones. So let's tackle these real quick. Alex Hirsch hasn't confirmed it. Well, as we talked about in the last section, he hasn't exactly deconfirmed it either, so saying he hasn't confirmed it outright doesn't really disprove this theory at all. Dipper grows chest hair, though. Yes, he does. There's a few potential explanations for this, but most notably, cis women can grow chest hair. So much so that there are articles about women going viral because of their chest hair. Sure, most women won't grow excessive amounts of chest hair, but we do know that within his genetics is Grunkle Stan, who does. So it's not impossible to assume that he can as well, especially since those with family members with excess hair growth are more at risk for hirsutism, the excess hair growth on women, and as we know, Grunkle Stan is one hairy guy.
Keep on shaving that hairy uncle!
He was presenting as a boy during flashbacks. Oh, this is a fun one. In the episode Weird Mageddon 2 Escape from Reality, we see flashbacks to as early as 2nd grade, and he seems to be presenting relatively masculinely at the time. Although one could argue it's more androgynous than anything, so whatever. The average age of a second grader is around 7 to 8, depending on birthdays. And considering the twins' birthdays at the start of the school year, in August, it's safe to assume he's around the age of 7 in this picture day flashback. Gender is first really learned in children at about the age of 2, and transgender kids may start questioning their gender as early as 2 or 3. And according to this study, by the age of about 7, kids start to understand the general concepts of sex, gender, and societal gender roles. So it is very clearly not impossible for Dipper to be presenting himself as masculine during these flashbacks. And since we don't see what he was like earlier than this, it's not impossible to assume he's felt this way for some time prior to this. He's going through a male puberty. Well, actually, we don't know that for 100% sure. As the only real pubescent things we see are his voice cracking, his attraction to Wendy, and being exceptionally sweaty at times. Now, while these are signs of male puberty, the voice cracking is also a phenomenon in female puberty as well. They also sense an increase in attraction. I mean, just look at Mabel.
Yeah, but do you need to flirt with every guy you meet?
My name is Mabel, but you can call me the girl of your dreams. I'm joking!
Women also go through the same sweatiness as men in puberty, but then there's the fact that he could be on pubertal suppressants, or puberty blockers. Puberty blockers are administered after the onset of puberty, which in girls is as early as 7 years old. So Dipper being on puberty blockers is not impossible, especially considering he's from California. Although, considering it would have been in the late 2000s when this happened, it might be less likely, but still not impossible. Notably, both California, where the Pines are from, and Oregon, where the show takes place, are quite liberal places where trans people are accepted more generally, which relates to our next point. His parents wouldn't let him transition. Now, this one is just kind of dumb, because we have no way of knowing that, one way or the other. We can make some assumptions based on what little information we have. Now, as I mentioned, the Pines live in California, and while it's nigh impossible to determine a general transgender acceptance rate, especially in the early 2000s, it's not unfair to assume that based on what little we know about them, the Pines are likely quite liberal and will be accepting of Dipper being trans. Mabel is notably an LGBTQ ally, as we mentioned earlier, and that is something that is more likely to happen when their parents are more liberal. But obviously, there's no way to know this for sure on either direction. He doesn't have eyelashes! Okay, so if you watch cartoons, this may make sense at first. Most often, women and girls in cartoons have eyelashes. So saying that Dipper doesn't have eyelashes could be proof of him not being trans, as if he were a girl, he would have eyelashes. But there's a dilemma here. For those who use this argument, not every woman in Gravity Falls has eyelashes. Now yes, a vast majority do. Over 70% in fact have eyelashes. There are a few exceptions. I looked through every woman on the Gravity Falls wiki, seeing how many have eyelashes. Excluding animals like gompers or weird ones like Amorphous Shape, we have a total of 21% of women in the series having no eyelashes. Most of these are unnamed background characters. This includes Angry Lady, Granny Sweetkin, Fertilla Mech and her daughters, Maud Duskerton, the Hand Witch, and Emma Sue's mom. Notably, there is one major female character who doesn't have eyelashes. Candy Chew. This is a super interesting thing to find out, actually. Notably, Grenda does have eyelashes. Which, if we take her as a trans character, then that just goes to show, what it seems like to me anyways, is that eyelashes may be a makeup thing, as characters who don't seem to wear makeup don't have eyelashes. But in reality, much like the fingers, it's probably just an art choice. But Alex Hirsch isn't trans. Okay, so this argument is dumb. And yes, I know that's sort of an ad hominem, but really, as we've talked about multiple times by this point, yes, Dipper is at least vaguely based on Alex, but that doesn't mean much, just because Alex isn't trans, as far as we know. Doesn't mean Dipper can't be. His chest is flat, / he doesn't have top surgery scars. This is the argument I see most often, and it's the most annoying one. Yes, transmasculine people often get double mastectomies to remove their breasts, and that typically leaves under-breast scars. However, there are two major reasons why this argument doesn't matter, and is quite dumb. Firstly, as we mentioned earlier, it's not impossible that Dipper is on pubertal suppressants. And if Dipper's gender dysphoria is as severe as we are assuming it is, there's a possibility that he gets on HRT with parental consent. Although typically they don't start HRT prior to the age 14. So both of these would stop the need for a double mastectomy in the first place. While breast development can start as early as 8 years old, with puberty blockers this growth is unlikely to happen. Considering these facts, it's not impossible for him to be flat-chested and without top surgery scars. But that was the last argument I see floating around, so we'll discuss where we sit on the Transmasc Theory at the end of the video. Now, I'll be very clear, this theory is not as common nor popular as the Transmasc Theory that the majority of this video is based on. But I've seen this theory growing in popularity on both Twitter and TikTok in recent years. It's obviously a more recent take on the theory, and even when looking into it, most of the content comes from recent years. Even this art comes from 2024. Credit, of course, goes to Melon Sharks, who created this art. It seems like the majority of this headcanon comes from the so-called Gravity Falls fandom renaissance that happened with the release of the Book of Bill in 2024. However, I'm not sure exactly when this theory first came into existence. Now, there's really not a lot of evidence for this. Unlike with the previous theory, it seems to be much more akin to a typical headcanon, where it mostly comes from liking the idea rather than the more argumentative style of the previous segments. So there's not really any evidence, as it were, at least not nearly to the same degree as the previous. This has been an entirely different style of research for this section as compared to the Transmasc portion of things, and almost all of it seems to stem from this specific reading. Almost every post about Transfemme Dipper seems to stem from the general idea of Dipper performing masculinity. Now, this is a valid interpretation and way to read Dipper. If you view Dipper as transfemme and performing his masculinity, I fully support that reading, even if I don't fully agree with it. There's not a ton of evidence that really fits into this theory, as most of the posts I see about this theory come from the aforementioned performing masculinity thing. But a lot of what I said in the previous segment could still very much apply to this side of things. Both Oregon and California are quite progressive states, so Dipper being trans would not be out of the question. In fact, some issues I brought up in the previous segment can be solved by this theory, such as the fact she grows chest hair naturally without having to get it into abnormalities. Dipper being transfeminine would not be out of the question by any standards, and I fully understand where the idea comes from, even though I have my issues with it. But it would be unfair to make this segment a complete and utter thrashing of a theory that, just because I personally disagree with it, this interpretation is perfectly valid. We'll save my personal thoughts for this at the conclusion of the video. Hey look! The word that'll get me silenced on Twitter! Let's fucking go! Some of you may be against me calling this a theory, but I'm doing so to keep the theming of the video consistent. When it comes down to it, it's likely that this was always the intention, and to imply that it wasn't is unfounded. However, I do think there's enough compelling evidence on the transmasculine reading to make sitting here and saying that Dipper is cis is honestly the boring option. Like, sure, we can take a look at all the evidence presented and take away the idea that Dipper is cis without much thought, because, as I said, it's likely the intention. Like, yes, Mason is a typically masculine name, so that being his real canonical name makes a lot of sense, especially if he's cis. And yes, the twins are fraternal, meaning that they don't need to be the same gender or sex. Plus, it makes Mabel's emasculating comments less seemingly transphobic. All of this makes perfect sense with the framing of Dipper as a cis kid. Plus, it means there's less research need to be done for the scenes we see on the younger Dipper and Mabel. So ascribing to the headcanon that Dipper is just a cis kid makes perfect sense. But it's also the least fun option. And as the title of the video implies, it's also the most likely answer. I don't think Alex Hirsch was thinking of Dipper as trans when he wrote the series. I think this is merely a fandom thing that got really popular, and I won't sit here and pretend otherwise. So where does that put us now? So where does that leave us? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there's no confirmation one way or another, so this is the point of the video where I talk about my personal opinions and conclusions about each theory. If you couldn't tell purely from how much I had to say about each of the different sections, I personally ascribe to the Transmasc headcanon. There's just so many compelling things about it. Sure, I still stand it's likely not the intended version of the story, but it still stands that there's a lot of stuff that really ticks my conspiracy boxes. As for the Transfemme Theory, well, I don't hate it, but I do have my concerns and complaints about it, which I'll get into right here. Personally, the performing his masculinity thing doesn't fit for me, because of a lot of things I mentioned in the previous section. To believe he is overperforming his masculinity to this degree feels odd to me personally, and considering just how disturbed he gets while being in Mabel's body, it makes it hard to read it this way. Although conceptually it could be a problem with being in a sister's body rather than being in a girl's body. A lot of the time, when discussing this headcanon, or at least seeing people talk about it, most of the evidence put forward in the Transmasc segment is either ignored or flipped on its head. Sure, Dipper could be hiding her hair because she doesn't like that it's short. Sure, Dipper could do girly things on instinct in Mabel's body because she has to perform masculinity rather than the femininity she would rather prefer. And yes, Mason could be a masculine dead name and that's why she prefers to be called Dipper. Although this last point really doesn't resonate with the info in General 3 about Dipper revealing her name to Ford, if she didn't want to be dead named by her new grunkle, she wouldn't have brought up her name. Or she would have brought up a different preferred name. Although once again, this could be flipped around and Mason is a preferred name. My problem comes from the fact that nothing specifically speaks to her being a trans woman in my mind. Unlike with the previous theory, which you could point to specific things to make Dipper transmasc, there's nothing that specifically points to a transfemme dipper in my mind. As always, feel free to correct me in the comments and tell me if there's any evidence I missed. At the end of the day, I believe Alex intended for Dipper to be a cis man, and that was the start and end of the day. There's also the reading that Dipper could be genderqueer, or gender fluid, or non-binary. Dipper is a very androgynous name that falls outside the gender binary. It fits a very non-binary kind of worldview. You know, it fits like a sky, or a storm, or a raven, or a fox. You know, these names that people make fun of for being the non-binary names. It falls in that vein. I don't think Dipper is written to be trans, but I think there's enough compelling evidence to argue that maybe he very well could be. And with that was the first episode of my new But series. It was a lot of fun to write, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I would love to thank Alex Hirsch and the writers and animators of Gravity Falls for this show. I also want to thank Wambu again for being in the background for both my research and writing. H. Bomber Guy for allowing me to rip off his style, and also for the foundations of the joke at the beginning of this episode. Finally, I would like to thank all of you watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. There's also a Patreon where you can see the bloopers for this video.